Yes, and thank you. And first of all, while you are fixing it, just give you an insight. The whole idea of EL2 is actually kind of doing research as part of Accelerate, and this is funded by Industriens Fund. And I kind of think that the vision around this was actually really great. Because the problem that we have today when we want to study entrepreneurship is usually kind of we start it in hindsight, right? So we go to Google and Starbucks and stuff like that and try to figure out why were they successful, right? And of course you get a good insight into their story and how they kind of formed their venture and built their company. But the problem is that the process of building a successful venture is usually really, really complex. So you probably, as Martin will tell you, make you 5,000 decisions a year, right? And basically 5 years after, you don't know what the kind of decision. You're not sure which decisions actually kind of made the venture successful. So what we are doing in EL2 is actually kind of doing, I don't know whether it's the first time in history, but one of the first time making a kind of a live laboratory for studying startup. So when companies go through Accelerate, we basically study them while they are making their decisions. So trying to figure out what are kind of the inputs that they get, what decisions does that make, and how do they kind of transform their idea and their venture into successful business. So you could call EL2 and the vision about EL2 and the foundation, industry foundation funded say, well, we want to do real life, real-time studies of entrepreneurship in the making. So this is what we do in EL2. And I will give you kind of a short overview of what we've done so far and some of the results that we have at the moment. And then also kind of give you an insight into kind of our future perspective so we can have that discussion afterwards. So the first thing is that there is kind of number of levels that you can study entrepreneurship from. So if you were in the position that I was before and sitting down with Anders, then you would kind of study entrepreneurship from a macro perspective. You would kind of look at all the framework conditions, kind of basically find out, well, how does the tax system kind of influence the incentives of building startup? What is kind of the legislation on bankruptcy, and how does that affect the startup? And we, Anders and I, have done numerous of analysis and benchmark systems, and every year Anders actually provide a really, really interesting report on kind of how are we doing in terms of kind of general framework condition for entrepreneurship in Denmark. And the funny thing is that it seems like we are basically constantly improving the conditions for entrepreneurship, also compared with other countries. But on the other hand, it doesn't seem to kind of spill over in concrete results in terms of more startup actually being successful. Another level of studying this is of course looking at the individuals, kind of looking at the entrepreneurs. Well, who are they and what kind of people and what do they know and stuff like that. Then you can look at it from kind of a company perspective and say, well, a startup is a company, so how do we look at it from a company perspective? And kind of the third thing you could look at is well, how do you look at it from an ecosystem or a community perspective? And what we are doing in EL2 is actually saying, well, we want to start by looking at it from the entrepreneur perspective, by kind of looking at it from the founder team, from the individuals, and understanding entrepreneurship from that. Then we want to bring it up to company level. How does kind of the individuals affect the company? And then we want to understand it from a community perspective. So how does the kind of the community around startup actually affect the creation of successful companies? And this is probably a little bit over ambitious to do, but this is kind of the journey that we are basically taking in EL2. So starting with the entrepreneurs. Well, there you also have a lot of perspectives, right? So you can look at entrepreneurs, say, well, it's all about talent, right? So you have a kind of a lot of studies out there saying, well, entrepreneurship is about talent. It's about special people touched by God in a special way, right? So we want to look into their brains. We want to look into how they were brought up and what they think and actually looking for the talent. So there's done a lot of study in that area. Then, of course, you can also look at it as, well, entrepreneurship is about experience. So the more you do it, the better you get at it. And, of course, you also look at it as kind of the opportunity. And this is a kind of where Saros would say, well, it's not about that, but looking from it in kind of the, well, from the technology perspective, well, is it a great idea? Is it a good opportunity? Is it kind of a hole in the market and stuff like that? And then you can look at it kind of from a fourth perspective that is kind of like learning. Well, can you actually learn this stuff, right? So what we started out with EL2 was say, well, can we actually start thinking about what is entrepreneurship? Is it talent? Is it just experience? Is it kind of the opportunity, or is it learning? It was kind of our first question. And what you would expect, basically, say, well, if it's talent, then you should, if you have a kind of a huge group of entrepreneurs, then you should basically be able to divide them into two, right? One group that is kind of outperforming the others because they have this special talent. Well, they have this kind of they are taught by God or born on a Saturday or whatever it is, right? So they have a special talent. The other thing that you say, well, if it's experience, then you see if you look at the relationship between the number of times you start up a company and the likelihood of it being successful, then you should have this kind of linear curve, right? Every time you start a company, you get more and more successful. If it was just a kind of about the opportunity, then, well, we may not be able to find a pattern, right? Well, there's no pattern in there. So what we did, and not what we did, but one of our PhD students, Rasmus, did, was kind of take a huge database of Swedish entrepreneurs, because we don't have that kind of database in Denmark, and say, well, how do they perform? What is the likelihood of success when we follow them over time? From kind of their first venture to the second, the third, and fourth, and stuff like that. And the first thing is, well, we couldn't find a pattern saying, well, we find a group of people who are just outperforming the others. So, well, it's not just about the talent, or at least, well, we cannot study talent, we cannot understand talent in that way. And the second thing was, well, we couldn't find the kind of a linear curve, say, well, every time you do it, you get more and more experience. And we couldn't find kind of that no pattern kind of thing. What we found was actually the curve down in the right corner, say, well, the first time you start a venture, you have some kind of likelihood of being successful. And maybe that's luck, maybe it's timing, and maybe it's a lot of other things. Well, but there is, of course, a possibility of success. The second time you start a venture, then you decrease your chance of success. And was kind of really, really amazing to us, right? The third time you start a venture, then you get back to the first time. Well, then the likelihood is actually like the first time entrepreneur. And then the curve starts rising, right? So when you do it the fourth, the fifth, and the sixth time, then your likelihood of making a successful venture actually increases quite dramatically. And then we thought, oh, well, this is interesting. And the interesting part is that, well, if you look at the shape of that curve, then it's basically a curve that you see in every type of learning, right? So it seemed to, well, there's some kind of learning in entrepreneurship. And you could basically, maybe you can actually learn it. So the next question, of course, the next interesting question is, of course, well, if entrepreneurship is about learning, then you have two questions, right? One is, what are the skills that you need to learn in order to be successful? And the second question is, of course, how do you learn those skills, right? So that's kind of the next thing that we are looking into. The problem is, of course, that, well, you could argue, just a moment, you could argue that, well, you have kind of multiple learning curves. So you have a learning curve depending on the time of your venture. So if you have kind of a life cycle of a company, then you need different skills when you are creating your idea, or when you're kind of scaling your business, and when you have to execute your business plan. So not to be kind of to make it really simple, we said, well, there are basically two periods of time in a startup company. One is what you say, the first phase where you are basically searching. You are in a search process. You are searching for your scalable business model. You are searching for that model that is going to say, well, now I can sell my product or my service in really, really big numbers. And when you get to that point, then you move into execution. And then it's about kind of executing. And the reason why that is interesting, and the reason why we want to focus on this, is kind of based on a huge discussion that we had in Denmark for years and years, So if you go for investors and say, well, why don't you invest more money in entrepreneurship? And they will say, well, there's not enough good ideas to invest in, right? So basically, well, the reason why we don't have a huge amount of, a huge number of successful entrepreneurs in Denmark, why is that? Is that because, well, we have bad ideas, basically? Is that because, well, we don't know how to execute ideas? Or what is it? And kind of our take on this is, well, the simple answer is that we don't have enough people who have the skills to run the search process and find the scalable business model and then drive it from there. And why do we have this thinking? Say, well, if you look at kind of all indicators that we have and done in the ministry on patent applications and research and numbers of money invested into kind of creating new ideas, well, we are actually some of the front runners, at least in Europe. So we invest in huge amount of money. We have a huge amount of patents and stuff like that. So it doesn't seem that, well, we are Danes and we get less good ideas than they do in America. On the other hand, well, it is kind of also a little bit funny to say, well, we don't have the people who are able to execute because, well, we have really strong people in Maersk and big corporations that is good at execution. So maybe the problem is that we do not have the kind of the people who have the skills to run this search process to that point where you find your scalable business model and then bring on the executors and stuff like that. So of course, saying, well, the interesting thing is, well, is the reason why we don't kind of create a huge amount of successful startup because we don't have enough people who have the skills of running this initial search process in search of a scalable business model. So that's the idea, and that's the reason why we focus at this area in our research. So we focus on the area, say, well, it's not a kind of a beginning of a startup. It's at that phase where you actually have to find your scalable business model, and we want to understand what are the skills in order to do that. And this is kind of what I said, that, well, we have plenty of ideas, we have plenty of startups, but we have few blockbusters. So this is the reason why we focus at exactly this area. And then what is, of course, interesting is, say, well, coming from Sarah, say, well, what is it that the successful entrepreneurs does differently? What is it that they have learned, and can we transform that into learning? And this is kind of our interpretation and our experience when working with the companies, and our kind of interpretation of Sarah's. Say, well, first of all, entrepreneurship is about action. It's not about kind of sitting in the room and doing strategies and stuff like that. It's about doing stuff, right? And the next thing is, well, how do you run that actionable process? Well, some of the things that the entrepreneurs does is, well, they have to kind of, well, we think the world is a little bit like that. And basically what they want to constantly test their assumption, test their idea on concrete people, whether it's customer or whatever. From that, of course, you get feedback. You get constant feedback when you talk to people and present them for stuff and stuff like that. And then you start thinking about, well, what are the patterns in that feedback? How can I interpret the feedback that I get from concrete customers? And how do I kind of, when do I turn that into concepts? As Sarah said, when do I kind of lock it down and say, well, now it's locked down and this is what I'm doing. Now I'm not changing it anymore in kind of the co-creation process. So this is the process that the entrepreneurs are running. So they're running these constant iterations. And kind of from our research, it seems like you have to run 7 to 10 of these iterations in order to come from your original idea to kind of your scalable business model. And the kind of the speed and the quality of these iterations is what kind of determines whether you're going to be successful or not. And of course, running these iterations, you do that with kind of the principles that Sarah has been talking about is kind of, well, these principles. So learning entrepreneurship is about learning these principles and kind of applying them to this iterative process. And this is basically what we are thinking and trying to find out, well, is there an efficient model or efficient way to kind of teach people these skills? Because if we do, then maybe we will have more successful entrepreneurs. We also looked into that with Christine and kind of what we know, and we don't know a lot about that. But the first thing that we learned in the study is, well, you learn through actions. Basically, you learn through doing it. The second thing that we kind of are looking at is, well, is there some kind of learning mechanism that is kind of an apprenticeship model? So it's a little bit like Star Wars. Well, you learn better if you actually basically work with someone who is more experienced. So can you actually apply that model? And then the third thing that we kind of start to realize is, well, it's going to take a lot of repetition, right? It's kind of, I think Sarah would put it in a way, say, well, it's like training a muscle, right? So it's kind of constantly doing the same and the same and the same, and this is how you start learning the method. But there is a kind of a lot of stuff to be studied even more and say, well, can you actually do an efficient learning process of these principles? So we don't know a lot, but we are kind of getting the ideas on how can you actually teach this, and can you, by that, actually say, well, you don't have to be an entrepreneur for 20 years. You can actually apply the skills even faster, have more successful companies, and basically increase the number of serial entrepreneurs even faster in an economy. So that's what we are looking into. The next level is, of course, what Ted is going to talk about. He'll say, well, of course you have to understand that the kind of, if you apply these skills to a specific business, how does that kind of leverage into to your business? And what we are studying here is kind of the business model as an indicator for how you change your business using these skills. So basically what we are trying to do, and Ted will dig deeper into this, is say, well, what are the changes in the business model during this process where you learn the skills and kind of repeat them and use them on your business? So how are you changing your business model? Of course, the big question is, well, these changes, are they for the good or the worse? And that we don't know yet, but hopefully in time we can start looking into that as well. Then the third level of things that we are trying to understand is kind of the community part of it. And the idea here is that our kind of assumption or hypothesis is that you can see regions in the world who is kind of constantly outperforming other regions in terms of high growth startup. So you can look at Silicon Valley, Massachusetts and stuff like that, and they are kind of constantly pouring out successful entrepreneurs. And why is that? Why do you have kind of regions in the world that over time are systematically outperforming? And what we've been studying alongside with, among others, Anders, is, well, do they have a special kind of community or a special kind of ecosystem? And there seems to be kind of four things in an ecosystem. One is kind of ideas and knowledge, and that is kind of in terms of knowledge institution and the quality of those institutions. The other thing is, of course, well, there is access to capital, whether it's formalized in venture capital, it's informalized in just rich people and stuff like that. And what we also see is that, well, in every region that is successful, you have kind of successful companies. But you don't just have successful companies, you have successful companies who want to give back to the community. You have successful companies who is interested in the next generation of startup companies. So that is interesting. And then you have a huge amount of serial entrepreneurs. So we basically have a lot of people who's done this before, and of course, maybe you can say, well, that's the reason why they're successful. But the big thing is that we also believe that being part of that community, the process of running this iterative process that is actually going to be faster and cheaper. Because you have a lot of people who's open for the co-creation part. So the more people that you have in a specific area, region, or economy that is open to these kind of co-creation and stuff like that, of course, the more successful companies you will have. And the lower the cost you will have of iterations, and the faster the process can go. So can you actually basically build an ecosystem and start thinking, well, how do you build an ecosystem? How do you make sure that you have a sufficient amount of knowledge institution, sufficient amount of capital, but also sufficient amount of successful companies willing to give back to the community, and sufficient amount of serial entrepreneurs willing to give back to the community, because then you can actually do startup cheaper and better. If you look at there's been done some study on how much money you in the early stages put into company in different kind of economies. An interesting thing is that actually in US and Silicon Valley, you put less money into early startup compared to Denmark. So we don't have a capital problem in Denmark. Basically, we are over-investing too early in companies. So it's basically from that indicator, and I say it's not science, but it seems like it's so much more expensive in the early stage where you are basically searching for your business model in Denmark compared to Silicon Valley. Just by the indicator of how much money you pour into to early startup. And maybe the reason is that, well, you don't have this community of co-creation, and therefore you have to attract money in order to get that process running. But that's kind of the next level of our study, understanding kind of how can you build this kind of community, and how do you get into the process of having big corporations and serial entrepreneurs giving back to society, and by that starting. And the interesting thing is, can you actually get this positive kind of spiral going, where kind of stronger network leads to better opportunity for co-creation, and that kind of attracts even better people and even better projects and even more capital and stuff like that. Can you actually create that in the economy or not? So this is what we are going to look further into in the future. Of course, what we've done in EL2 so far is just kind of scratching the surface. So some of the perspectives that kind of in the longer run that is kind of outside our project at the moment are some of the things. Well, the first thing is, of course, it's so interesting to say, well, this concept of effectuation and the principles, how do you apply that in different industries? Well, is it basically the same model that you do in all industries? So it's basically generic stuff, or do you have to adapt it whether you are in different industry? The next thing that we will look that you could focus on is, of course, kind of what are the role of all the actors. So how do you build these kind of communities? And the most interesting thing for me is kind of the fourth point is say, well, what is the role of this established industry in order to create a kind of a vibrant startup community? And I think that here you could have kind of a new perspective of startup that could be interesting, saying, well, startup, as we look at it in Denmark, say, well, startup are good because they create jobs and stuff like that. But what is kind of the value of startups in terms of the competitiveness of established industries? So could you look closer into that? And then, of course, the third thing is, well, can we start making smarter on what are the indicators that you actually found your scalable business model? Because when we're working with companies, well, where are you at that tipping point where you start working differently with your company? Where you basically go for kind of the effectual model to a more causal model. When is that, and what is the indicators in different kind of industries? Well, we actually found our scalable business model. So could you look closer into to finding these kind of indicators of, well, we found the scalable business model. So these are some of the things that in the future, coming from the studies that we've done so far, that could be interesting to look even closer into. So yes, that was it for me.